The most dangerous woman is not the one who destroys you with fire. She is the one who lets you burn yourself, then walks away with what's left. The crystal chandelier above the mahogany dining table cast prismatic light across 6 place settings, but it was the silence following Sloane's voice that actually shattered something inside me. I sat there, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth, as the steam from garlic mashed potatoes rose like a ghost between us. My sister, Sloane, 5 years younger, infinitely more beautiful, and catastrophically more loved, didn't even glance in my direction. She was too busy watching her 10-carat diamond catch the light as she reached for the crystal. My mother chuckled, that soft, tinkling sound she reserved for moments when cruelty felt civilized. My father didn't look up from his ribeye. "Oh, don't look so wounded, Beatrice," Sloane said, her voice dripping with the fake concern she deployed like a weapon. She turned to Marcus, her fiancé, a man who looked at her like she was the sun, and in her reflection believed himself to be the planet, and then back to the table. "I'm just saying, it's a good thing Beatrice loves the paperwork. Some people need to feel useful, even when they're completely replaceable. It gives her a little purpose while we handle the actual living. You know, the air left my lungs. I looked at my hands. These hands, the ones that had spent the last 10 years managing 12 rental properties, handling midnight plumbing emergencies at the Arlington on 3rd Street, coordinating contractors, balancing spreadsheets that ran into the millions, and keeping this family's entire financial architecture from collapsing like a house built on sand. I was 32 years old, and for a decade, I had been the invisible CEO of the Miller family real estate empire. And they had just called me replaceable. "Actually," my father said, finally acknowledging me with a glance, "your sister makes a good point. The Elm Street property, the Victorian your grandmother left you, will need to move on that soon. The wedding is going to require significant capital, and that's your most liquid asset. The Victorian, the one I'd spent 3 years personally restoring, the one where I'd peeled back 7 layers of wallpaper by hand, where I'd sanded the original oak floors until my fingers bled, where I'd stood in the empty master bedroom and allowed myself to imagine a future that was mine. The Elm Street house isn't for sale," I said quietly. Sloane's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, don't be sentimental. It's the only asset liquid enough to cover the venue deposit for the Hamptons' wedding. Besides, what do you need a 4-bedroom house for? You're single, and let's be honest, you're married to your spreadsheets." My mother reached over and patted my hand, her touch somehow managing to feel both sympathetic and dismissive. "Sloane's wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event, Beatrice. We have to prioritize the family's image. You've always been the reliable one. You'll understand." That was the moment I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The reliability they loved wasn't loyalty. It was my willingness to be a doormat. I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't a sister. I was a resource. And resources, once exploited to their limit, are discarded. I set down my fork with deliberate care. "Excuse me," I said, standing up. "I have work to do." Behind me, Sloane giggled. "See? Already running back to her spreadsheets. Some people really do get off on that kind of thing." I didn't turn around. I walked out of the dining room, down the hallway, and into the small office in the back of the main rental building where I'd spent 1,000 nights managing their empire. The door clicked shut. The world stayed loud for a while, then faded. And in that silence, I made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, I arrived at the office at 4:47 a.m. The space smelled of old paper and stale coffee, the fluorescent lights humming their tired song. I pulled the master file for the Elm Street Victorian and opened it with hands that were shaking, not from fear, but from rage so cold it felt like clarity. The deed was filed under the family corporation's name, not mine. Theirs. I flipped through the transfer documents. My father had done it 5 years ago, right after my grandmother's funeral. He'd had me sign paperwork for tax purposes, he'd said. I remembered that conversation. How he'd assured me it was just a formality. How he'd kept the original deed in his safe deposit box for safekeeping. I had been paying the property taxes out of my own salary. I had been paying the insurance, every penny of maintenance, every upgrade, every restoration. It had all come from the $42,000 a year I made managing 12 properties worth over $30 million. I pulled up the company's financial records and began to dig. What I found made my stomach drop. The rentals were bringing in nearly $40,000 a month in gross revenue. The properties were well-maintained, fully occupied, and historically stable. Yet the company accounts showed a cash flow that looked like a slow-motion drowning. I started following the money. There. Transfers to a personal account in Sloane's name. $50,000 for a consulting fee for a job she'd never worked. $100,000 for a European consulting trip. Designer bags from boutiques in Milan and Paris, charged to the company credit card. And then I found something worse. My father had taken out multiple lines of credit against the properties themselves. Not to improve them or refinance at better rates. No, to fund his own lifestyle. Country club fees. Luxury car leases. A second mortgage on the main mansion they'd never disclosed. The family wasn't wealthy. The family was drowning. And they were planning to sell my inheritance. The only thing my grandmother had actually left for me, to throw a wedding that would cost more than my annual salary just to keep up appearances while they sank deeper into debt. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. For a long moment, I did nothing. Then I opened my email and started typing. The thing about being the invisible CEO is that nobody realizes you have all the keys until it's too late. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Confrontation is what they expected. Anger is what they could gaslight. Tears would make me dramatic. Instead, I became something far more dangerous. I became cold. At work, I was efficient and professional. At home, I was present and helpful. I helped Sloane pick out bridesmaids' dresses. Ugly, washed-out beige, things designed to make me look like a ghost. I smiled and nodded when she mentioned how much more professional it would look to have a real manager handle the properties. Someone with presence, she said. Someone who wasn't always tired. Meanwhile, I was making phone calls. I met with Thomas Chun, a lawyer who specialized in commercial real estate and had absolutely no connection to my father's social circle. I showed him the transfer documents, the tax records, the evidence of fraudulent fund transfers. Your father essentially stole your inheritance, Thomas said flatly, sliding the documents back across his desk. But it gets worse. Your grandmother's original will establish you as a 30% stakeholder in the physical properties, not just the rental income, but the assets themselves. That partnership agreement was designed to survive corporate restructuring. It's in the fine print of the 1982 partnership agreement your grandmother drew up with your grandfather. My heart stopped. So the corporate transfer, it wouldn't have been legal without my consent. Exactly. And more importantly, he pulled out another document. I found this. Your father filed papers last week to restructure the company entirely, removing you from the partnership agreement. But he didn't properly dissolve the original partnership first. That's a massive legal error. The restructuring is void. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes sharp, which means you still own 30% of every property, including the Victorian, and which also means that the sale of the Elm Street house cannot go forward without your signature on the deed of trust. I felt something shift in my chest. Not triumph, exactly. Something colder. What if I told you, I said slowly, that he already used my signature? Thomas's eyebrows shot up. On what? on a preliminary agreement. I found a copy in the deal file, my signature on a document I never signed. The lawyer's face went very still. That's a felony, Beatrice. That's forgery. That gives you leverage you can't even imagine. I leaned back in my chair. I don't want him in jail. I want the properties. If you play this correctly, Thomas said, you won't just get the houses. You'll control the entire Miller property portfolio. But you have to be strategic. If you move now, while he still thinks he has options, he'll find a way to pivot. He'll hide assets, lie to lenders, do whatever it takes. You need to wait until the closing day of the Elm Street sale. Let him believe he's won. Let him think the money is minutes away from hitting his account. I nodded slowly. And then you pull the floor out from under him. The week before the wedding was a masterclass in narcissism. Sloan was having a meltdown because the orchids, fresh white orchids flown in from Japan at a cost of $8,000, were apparently a shade too creamy instead of stark white. My mother was in full panic mode about the catering, the seating chart, the optics of every single detail. My father was permanently stationed at his desk, his face a shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure medication was a suggestion rather than a requirement. I moved through it all like a ghost at my own haunting. Beatrice, my father called from his study. The closing docs for Elm Street, where are they? I appeared in the doorway with a serene smile. Marcus has them, Dad. The real estate agent says the buyers are ready to move. We're set to close on Friday morning, the day before the wedding. The funds should be wired into the corporate account by noon. He let out a breath of relief, so profound it seemed to take years off his face. Good girl. I knew I could count on you. This sale is going to save everything, Beatrice. Once this closes, we'll be solid again. We'll talk about that promotion we discussed. I knew what the promotion actually meant. More work, less pay, deeper invisibility. I'm looking forward to it, I said, my voice like silk. Behind the scenes, I was having different conversations. I called Marcus, the real estate agent, a man my father had worked with for 20 years. Marcus, it's Beatrice. Beatrice, I was just about to call your father. The buyers are ready. They want to close Friday morning, just before the wedding. Everything is set. I know, I said. That's why I'm calling. There's been a small development with the title work. Nothing to worry about, but we need to be cautious. I need you to funnel all communications through my private email, not my father's. He's extremely stressed with the wedding, and I'm coordinating the closing details on his behalf. Marcus hesitated. He knew I ran the operation, but he also knew my father had a temper. Are you sure? He was very clear that he wanted to be notified. I'm positive. In fact, I'll be handling the final walkthrough and document delivery personally. My father will sign the papers, but I'll be managing the logistics. It's more efficient this way. After he agreed, I hung up and opened my encrypted laptop. I began drafting the paperwork I would need, not to sell the house, but to stop the sale. I spent hours pulling documentation. I found the original partnership agreement my grandmother had drawn up. I gathered every piece of evidence showing the fraudulent transfer of the deed. I compiled the emails where my father had discussed selling my inheritance without my consent. Thomas had assured me that once I revealed the forged signature and the invalid corporate restructuring, the sale would be legally blocked. The title company would have to refuse to close. My father would be unable to explain why, and the statute of limitations on covering his tracks would be measured in hours. But that wasn't all I was preparing for. I also visited the tenants in each of the 12 properties. I didn't tell them everything. I simply told them that management would be changing soon, and that I wanted them to know they were valued, that their leases were secure, and that the properties would continue to be well maintained. They looked at me with something like recognition, because they already knew. They'd always known who actually ran things. I spent Thursday night in my small bedroom in the mansion, surrounded by the sound of my family's dying empire. And I felt something like peace. The house was chaos. Hairstylists, makeup artists, delivery people, and florists swarmed through the halls like locusts. Sloane was in the center of it all, playing bride-to-be with the intensity of a theater major who'd finally gotten the lead role. I dressed in a sharp navy blue suit and slipped out the back door at 7:30 a.m. The title company's office was in a glass building downtown. Marcus was waiting in the lobby, looking nervous. I'd never seen Marcus nervous before. "Beatrice," he said, "your father isn't here. He said he'd meet us at the signing." "I know," I replied. "There's been a complication with the paperwork. We need to discuss it before he arrives." I walked into the closing room and set down my briefcase. Marcus followed, along with the title company representative, a woman named Catherine who'd been handling Miller Properties for 7 years. "I need to show you something," I said, pulling out the original partnership agreement. This document from 1982 establishes a partnership between my grandmother, my grandfather, and my father, but it also includes a covenant. Any changes to the partnership structure require unanimous consent from all stakeholders. Catherine frowned. "Yes, I'm familiar with this. Your father mentioned it was resolved." "He mentioned it was resolved," I repeated, "but it wasn't." "He filed papers to restructure the company and remove me from the partnership without ever getting my consent. That restructuring is legally void." I pulled out the second document, which means the partnership agreement remains in force, which means I own 30% of the physical assets, not just the profits. Marcus's face was going pale. "Beatrice, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that the sale of the Elm Street property cannot proceed without my signature on the deed of trust, and I didn't sign it." Catherine opened the preliminary sales agreement. "There's a signature here. Beatrice Miller." "That's not my signature," I said calmly. "It's a forgery. I have documentation from my attorney showing that my father executed it without my knowledge or consent." The silence that followed was deafening. "You understand," Catherine said slowly, "that if you're claiming signature forgery, we cannot close this sale. We cannot, in fact, do anything until this is resolved through legal channels." "I understand," I said, "and I'm prepared to provide a written statement to that effect, notarized with my attorney's contact information." Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. "Your father is going to, Beatrice, this is his entire financial plan. The wedding is tomorrow. The venue, the catering, everything is paid for on the contingency that this money comes through." "I know," I said quietly. "And you're blocking it? You're doing this to your own family." I looked at him, at this man who had watched me manage 11 properties perfectly for a decade, who had seen me show up to walk-throughs in the rain, who had never once suggested that maybe I deserved more respect than a middle manager at a company I actually owned. They stopped being my family the moment they decided I was replaceable. I said, "And I'm not blocking the sale. I'm just stopping them from selling something that isn't theirs to sell. What happens next is up to them." I turned to Catherine. "I'm exercising my legal right to prevent the transfer of property that I have a stake in. I'll have a formal objection to the sale, signed by my attorney, to you within the hour." Then I walked out. I drove to a small coffee shop 3 towns over and ordered a croissant and an espresso. I turned my phone off. I knew what was happening at the mansion. I could picture it like a film reel. My father checking his phone for the wire transfer that would never come. The venue calling to confirm payment. The florist demanding the final invoice be settled. The catering company asking about the deposit that was supposed to clear. My mother beginning to understand that something was wrong. Sloane's face as reality started to crack the carefully constructed facade. I sat in that cafe for 3 hours and didn't check my email once. When I finally turned my phone back on at 2 p.m., there were 47 missed calls, 32 text messages, 17 voicemails. My father, "Beatrice, where are you? There's a problem with the closing. The title company won't release the documents. Call me immediately." My mother, "Beatrice, sweetheart, I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding. Can you come home?" Sloane, "Beatrice, where the fuck are you?" And then, finally, at 1:47 p.m., Julian, my older brother, the one who usually stayed out of family drama, I don't know what's happening, but Dad's in his study with his lawyer, and he looks like he's about to have a heart attack. Did you do something?" I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I drove to my small apartment across town, the one I'd rented 6 months ago, just in case. I'd been preparing for this longer than I'd admitted to myself. I unpacked the duffel bag I'd prepared 2 weeks earlier, containing everything I might need for the next 72 hours. Documents, copies of records, my laptop with all the files. Then I called Thomas. "It's done," I said. "The closing fell apart," he asked. "Completely. The title company refused to process. He has no way to get the money now." Thomas laughed, a sharp, satisfied sound. "Perfect. Now, we move to phase 2. I've already prepared a counterclaim. In the morning, we file a formal objection to the unauthorized corporate restructuring and a suit for recovery of fraudulent transfers. I've also contacted a forensic accountant. Your father's been embezzling company funds for personal use, moving money to Sloane's accounts, paying her a salary for work she never did. That's criminal, Beatrice. Your father has committed felonies. I don't want to press criminal charges," I said. "Not yet. I want leverage first." Then we used the threat of charges as negotiation. Trust me, once your father realizes he's facing potential prison time, he'll be very motivated to discuss terms. "What kind of terms?" "The kind where he signs over the entire property portfolio to you, clears the company debts, and accepts a settlement that keeps him out of jail." I closed my eyes. "He'll fight it. He'll lose," Thomas said. "You have documentation, forged signatures, embezzled funds, and a partnership agreement that's legally ironclad. He's not fighting from a position of strength, Beatrice. He's fighting from a position of desperation. And desperate people always make mistakes." I watched from across the street, parked in my car with a clear view of the church. I saw Sloane arrive at 10:47 a.m., 14 minutes behind schedule. Her white dress, the one that had cost $8,000, dragged on the pavement. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was flawless. Her face was a mask of barely contained panic. There were no orchids. The florist had taken them back at 9 a.m. when the credit card declined. There was no horse-drawn carriage. The rental company had called when the deposit check bounced. The venue had locked the doors at 9:30 a.m. after the catering company informed them that payment would not be received. Only 37 guests had shown up, the ones who were already in the area and confused about what was happening. I watched as Sloane stood on the church steps in her expensive dress, looking at the sparse crowd. And then she just broke. Her shoulders collapsed. Her perfect posture crumbled. She looked small. She looked replaceable. My father arrived an hour later, looking 10 years older than he had the day before. He was still on the phone with lawyers, his voice hoarse from shouting. My mother sat on the church bench, silently crying. And Sloane sat in the vestibule in her white dress, surrounded by flowers that no one wanted, and she waited for a wedding that was never going to happen. By 1 p.m., the church had been emptied. The confused guests had returned to their hotel rooms. The bride and her ruined wedding had become a cautionary tale that would spread through the country club faster than any scandal ever had. I drove away. Monday morning, Thomas filed the paperwork. An official objection to the unauthorized corporate restructuring, a suit to recover fraudulent transfers of company funds, documentation of embezzlement, and a formal notice that criminal charges would be considered depending on how cooperatively my father engaged in settlement discussions. My father's lawyer called Thomas by 10 a.m. By noon, we were sitting in a conference room that smelled like expensive wood and desperation. My father looked destroyed, not angry, destroyed, like a man who'd finally understood that the foundation his entire life was built on was sand. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hollow. "I want you to listen," I said, speaking for the first time. I hadn't planned to be in this meeting. Thomas had advised against it, but I needed him to hear this from my voice, not through a lawyer. The company is yours in name only. The reality is that it's mine. I've been running it for a decade. I know every property, every tenant, every line item on every budget. I know the value. I know the problems. And I know that without me, it will collapse. "Beatrice," he started, but I held up my hand. "You're going to transfer the entire property portfolio to a new entity. B. Miller Holdings. You're going to accept a settlement payment, $300,000 from the company accounts. That's enough for you, my mother, and Sloan to live modestly for 3 years. And then you're going to let me rebuild what you destroyed." "And if I don't?" he asked, though we both knew the answer. "Then Thomas files the criminal charges tomorrow morning. You'll face felony embezzlement charges. Your assets will be seized. Your professional reputation will be destroyed. And I'll still end up owning the properties. I'll just do it while you're in prison." My father's face went gray. "Your mother, Sloan, what happens to them?" "They move into the 4th Street rental, the 2-bedroom unit. It's affordable, it's clean, and it's where you'll live until you can do better. Just like you told me, I could live there when you were selling my inheritance." He flinched. "You called me replaceable." I continued, and my voice was steady, cold, clear. "You were wrong. I was the most valuable asset you ever had, and you threw me away because you were too blind to see it." The settlement was finalized within 48 hours. My father signed over the entire property portfolio. He accepted a payment that was a fraction of what he'd stolen, and he avoided prosecution by the narrowest of margins, conditional on his acceptance of an audit and his agreement to never make decisions regarding the properties again. By Wednesday, the deed was in my name. I didn't move back into the family mansion. Instead, I drove to the Elm Street Victorian on a Thursday morning, unlocked the door with my key, and stepped into the foyer of my grandmother's house. It was finally mine. I walked through the rooms I'd restored with my own hands. The oak floors gleamed like gold in the morning light. The walls held the careful work of 3 years of my life. The kitchen had been completely renovated, granite counters, new appliances, everything I'd chosen and installed myself. I stood in the middle of the living room, and I cried, not from sadness, from relief. The first call I made was to the tenants in all 12 properties. I introduced myself as the new owner of Miller Properties, now operating as B. Miller Holdings. I assured them that their leases were secure, their rent would remain the same, and that I would be personally managing their concerns from here forward. They seemed happy about this. The second call was to Marcus. "I'm keeping you as our listing agent." I told him, "But let's be clear about something. You knew what was happening. You knew that my family was treating me like I was help, and you never said anything." There was silence on the other end. "Then, you're right. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix anything. But going forward, you work for me. And my expectation is that you treat me with the same respect you give to my father. Can you do that?" Yes, he said. I can do that. The third call was to a developer I'd met at a property management conference 2 years earlier. His name was Daniel, and he'd once told me he'd been watching my work for years. He'd said I had vision. I'd thought he was just being nice. I want to develop something. I told him, not just rental properties. I want to build community housing, mixed income, beautiful, the kind of place where people actually want to live. Can you help me? I would be honored, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. The story spread through the country club like wildfire. The servant who became the queen, the local paper called it. How a property manager built an empire. People who had once ignored me at cocktail parties suddenly wanted to be my friends. They sent congratulations baskets. They asked for advice on their own real estate portfolios. They wanted to know my secrets. I ignored most of them. I was too busy working. I spent my days at the properties meeting with contractors, planning renovations, talking to tenants. I spent my nights in the Elm Street Victorian, drawing up plans for something new, a community center, and affordable housing development on land I'd quietly purchased property by property over the past year. Daniel became my partner in more ways than one. We worked 16-hour days, designing something that felt like it mattered. 2 months after the collapsed wedding, I received a letter from my father's lawyer. Your parents are requesting to speak with you regarding a reconciliation. They're interested in discussing terms. I threw it away without reading the rest. A week later, my brother Julian showed up at my apartment. He looked different, thinner, tired, but somehow more real than I'd ever seen him. The scandal had cost him his high-paying job at a prestigious firm. They didn't want the Miller name attached to their brand. He'd been fired by association. I'm not here to ask for money, he said, standing in my doorway. Good, I replied, because I'm not offering any. I know. That's not why I came. He paused. I watched them tear you down for years. I saw what they were doing, and I did nothing because it was easier. It was less painful to pretend I didn't notice than to stand up for you. I didn't say anything. I'm starting over, he continued. I'm working construction, bottom of the ladder, and it's the most honest I've felt in years. I studied my brother, really looked at him, for the first time in a decade. The 8th Street building needs a new roof. Structural work, the whole foundation needs inspection. If you want the job, it's yours. But you get no special treatment. You're just another contractor to me. He nodded, and something passed between us. Not forgiveness. Exactly. But the beginning of it. I'll take it, he said. 4 months after the wedding that wasn't, the bank moved forward with its auction. My father's personal debts, combined with the company's liabilities, had left them no choice. The bank would be auctioning off the property portfolio to recover their losses. I was listed as the primary insider with right of first refusal, a legal privilege that came with my stakeholder status. I'd been saving every penny I'd ever made, but I also had something my father never had, someone willing to believe in me. Daniel had secured funding from a consortium of investors who believed in the housing development project. They saw the properties not just as investments, but as a foundation for something meaningful. The auction was held on a Tuesday morning in a downtown auction house. Rows of real estate investors, hedge fund managers, and developers filled the seats. My father sat in the front row, looking like a man attending his own funeral. I sat in the back, wearing dark sunglasses and a hat. We're beginning the auction with the Miller property portfolio, the auctioneer announced. 12 properties, mixed residential and commercial, total appraised value approximately $28 million. We'll be auctioning this as a complete package. $5 million, someone bid. 5.5, another voice called. $6 million, a third investor offered. I stood up. $7 million, I said, my voice carrying through the room, and I'm exercising my stakeholder right of first refusal. The room turned. My father's eyes went wide. I removed my sunglasses. 7 million cash, I repeated, looking at the auctioneer. And I'm exercising my 30% stakeholder privilege, which means my bid supersedes any other offers. There was a moment of absolute silence. Then the auctioneer smiled. Sold. To the lady in the back. I walked down the aisle. My father stood up, his hands trembling. Beatrice, he whispered, you bought them? For us. You're saving the family? I stopped in front of him and looked at his face, the face of a man who still didn't understand what had happened. I bought them for me, Dad. I said, I'm the new owner of B. Miller Holdings. You're going to get your $300,000 settlement, as agreed, and then you're going to start over just like everyone else. My mother, who had been sitting beside him, let out a sound like a wounded animal. Where are we supposed to go? She cried. I hear the 4th Street rental is available, I said, quoting her own words back to her. The 2-bedroom unit. It's close to the action. You'll understand. We have to prioritize the company's image, after all. The community center opened 18 months later. It was called the Beatrice Miller Estates, named not after me, but in honor of the community it served. 40 affordable housing units, each one beautifully designed. A community center with a library, a job training facility, and a small cafe. Green spaces, playgrounds, the kind of place where people could actually build lives. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by the mayor, the city councilman, and 300 residents who already lived there or had registered to live there. I stood on the steps of the main building, listening to the speeches, and I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was something better. This was legacy. My father was not invited to the ceremony. Neither was my mother or Sloan. I heard later that my father had attempted to sue the trust my grandmother had set up, trying to claim that the land belonged to the family. The legal walls my grandmother had built were impenetrable. The case was dismissed within weeks. He spent his remaining days bitter and broken, a man who had everything and threw it away because he couldn't value the person who kept it all together. My mother died 5 years later. I didn't attend the funeral, but I did pay for it. It was the last act of daughterly duty I performed. Sloan eventually moved out of state. I heard rumors that she was waitressing in Florida, still trying to find someone to pay her way. The fiancé had left her the week after the wedding collapsed. He sued for the return of his engagement ring, which my father had pawned to pay for his lawyer. The irony was exquisite. 10 years after the dinner, where I was called replaceable, I stood in the kitchen of the Elm Street Victorian, looking out at my life. The oak floors shone like gold. The windows I'd restored let in perfect morning light. The kitchen, my kitchen, was filled with the smell of fresh coffee and possibility. I looked at a photograph from that dinner, still in its frame on the mantel. Sloan in the center, glowing. Me in the corner, holding a serving tray. I took it down and put it in a box in the attic. I didn't need to destroy it. I didn't need to burn it. It was just a relic of a life I no longer lived. A costume I'd outgrown. My phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. The new development is approved for Phase 3. We're breaking ground next month. I smiled. 3 years earlier, I'd married him. Not because I needed saving, I'd saved myself long ago, but because he'd offered something I'd never had, genuine partnership. He respected my mind. He challenged my vision. He believed in what I was building, not because it made him money, but because it meant something. We had a daughter now, 3 years old, with her father's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. Her name was Grace. She was being raised in a world where hard work meant something, where women weren't invisible, where love was earned not extracted. Julian had become one of my most trusted contractors. He'd built an entire crew from people like him, people who'd fallen and were learning to stand again. His work was impeccable. More importantly, he was present. He showed up to family dinners at my table, not begging for scraps, but sitting as an equal. He'd apologized, not with words, but with years of consistent effort. I respected that. I pulled up the company ledgers on my laptop. Miller Holdings now managed 17 properties, including the original 12 and 5 new acquisitions. The community housing project had expanded to 2 locations, with a third breaking ground in 3 weeks. The company was profitable, genuinely profitable, not built on debt and desperation like my father's version had been. My assistant, Maria, knocked on the office door. "Miss Miller, the contractor meeting is ready whenever you are." I'd hired Maria 3 years ago. She'd worked at my father's office before, doing the same job for half the pay and none of the recognition. I'd tripled her salary, given her benefits, and made it clear that her work mattered. She'd wept when I offered her the position. "Thank you," I said, standing up. "Let's make sure the 9th Street property specs are perfect. That building is going to be stunning." 6 months later, I received an invitation to the annual real estate gala, the same event where my father had been a founding member for 20 years, a place where he drunk expensive wine and laughed about deals while I stayed home managing the properties that made those deals possible. This year, they wanted me as the keynote speaker. The woman who built an empire, a story of vision and integrity, the invitation read. I almost threw it away. Then I thought about what it meant. I was no longer invisible. The gala was held in the grand ballroom downtown, all crystal chandeliers and black tie elegance. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was standing in the same room, wearing the same kind of dress, but this time I wasn't serving. I was being served. The room was full of people who'd watched my ascent, some with admiration, some with envy, some with the uncomfortable awareness that they'd underestimated me. I delivered my speech to a standing ovation. I talked about the importance of recognizing the invisible workers in our industry. I talked about how properties weren't just investments. They were homes, lives, futures. I talked about how building community meant more than quarterly returns. As the applause faded, I saw a figure slip into the back of the ballroom. Sloane. She'd aged. Not in years, but in the way desperation ages a person. Her dress was nice, but off-season. Her makeup was overdone, trying too hard to recreate something she'd lost. She looked like a ghost of the girl who'd sat at the dinner table and called me replaceable. For a moment, our eyes met. Then she raised her hand. "How does it feel?" she called out, her voice cracking. "How does it feel to ruin your own family, just to feel useful?" The room went stone silent. I could have had security remove her. I could have ignored her. I could have responded with anger. Instead, I stepped closer to the microphone. "You want to know how it feels?" I said, my voice carrying through the silent room. "It feels like justice, Sloane. But you wouldn't understand that. You only understand price tags. And you finally found out that you couldn't afford me." I paused, letting the words settle. "You know what the real tragedy is? You could have had this. You could have learned. You could have grown. But that would have required seeing me as a person instead of a mirror to reflect your own importance. That would have required humility. And humility was never one of your talents." I looked away from her, back at the audience. The woman who raised us taught me that invisibility is a choice. My grandmother, Beatrice Sr., built an empire by being seen. Not by showing off, but by doing the work, honestly and with integrity. I spent 10 years being invisible because I allowed it. The moment I decided I was worth seeing, everything changed. The applause that followed was different. It wasn't polite. It was thunderous. Security gently removed Sloane from the ballroom. As they escorted her out, I watched her shoulders collapse. She'd come looking for a confrontation. She'd found a reckoning instead. I felt no triumph, just a deep, abiding clarity. You cannot hurt someone who no longer needs you to see them. A week after the gala, I received a certified letter at my office. I recognized the handwriting before I opened it. Sloane's expensive script, still trying to pretend she was important. You have more than you need, it read. You're being selfish. Give us the Elm Street house, and we'll call it even. We're family after all. I didn't respond with a letter. I responded with a legal notice. The notice informed Sloane that I was suing her for recovery of fraudulent consulting fees, the nearly $300,000 she'd stolen from the company over 5 years. It laid out every transaction, every shopping spree, every lie about work she'd never done. The lawsuit wasn't about the money. It was about making sure she understood that there were consequences for the choices she'd made. She could have worked. She could have contributed. She could have built something. Instead, she'd spent her life letting other people carry her weight. And when I set her down, she broke. The case was settled quietly, with Sloane's lawyers requesting a non-disclosure agreement. She paid nearly $200,000 to make it go away. The rest would come out of installments she'd be making for the next 5 years. I heard she'd found a job, a real job, working retail at a department store in another state. The shame had driven her far away from everyone who'd known her before. I didn't feel guilty about it. Sometimes mercy is letting people face the consequences of their own actions. 2 years after the gala, while renovating the 3rd floor of the Elm Street Victorian, my contractor found something. A hidden compartment in my grandmother's antique desk built into the back of the drawers. Inside was a leather journal, yellowed with age, and a sealed envelope with my name on it. Beatrice. It read in my grandmother's careful handwriting. I sat on the floor of the master bedroom and opened it with trembling hands. My dearest girl, if you're reading this, it means I've passed, and it means you found your strength. I want you to know something about your father. I've known for years what kind of man he is. Greedy, weak, incapable of understanding that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the people who believe in you and the work you do with integrity. I didn't just leave you the house. That was too obvious, too easy for him to take. What I left you was far more valuable. 3 acres of prime commercial land. Downtown. Worth more than you can imagine. It's in a trust that has no connection to the family corporation. Your father doesn't even know it exists. I put it away for you when you were born because I saw something in you that I saw in myself. The capacity to build, not destroy. Build. When you find this land, and I know you will, use it wisely. Build something that means something. Build something that will still matter 100 years from now. I'm proud of you, Beatrice. I was always proud of you, even when you couldn't see it. Your grandmother. P.S. The deed is in the envelope. The land is registered under your birth name, Beatrice Eleanor Miller, in a trust established in 1982. No one can touch it. It is yours. I opened the second envelope with shaking hands. The deed was there. 3 acres of the most valuable commercial real estate in the city. Prime location. Listed as my sole property, established in a trust that predated my father's ownership of anything. My grandmother had given me not just a house. She'd given me the means to build a kingdom, and I'd already started using it. The community center, the housing developments, the 3rd project currently under construction. They were all built on this land, built on my grandmother's belief in me, built on her understanding that real power isn't what you inherit, it's what you create. I called Daniel immediately. She knew. I told him. My grandmother knew everything. She set this all up for me. I know. Daniel said quietly. You knew. I suspected. When Thomas first gave me the legal documents, I saw the trust establishment date. Your grandmother basically created a legal fortress around your future. She anticipated your father's greed. She planned for this. I felt something shift inside me. The last piece of the puzzle. My grandmother hadn't just left me a house. She'd left me a message, a roadmap, a belief that extended across generations. You are capable of extraordinary things if you believe in yourself. I'd finally learned what she was trying to teach me. 5 years after the dinner, where I was called replaceable, I was invited to speak at my alma mater's business school. The auditorium was packed with students, many of them women who'd come specifically to hear my story. I looked out at their faces, and I saw myself hungry, uncertain, full of potential, but unsure if they had the right to claim it. I want to tell you about invisibility. I began. Not the kind from comic books. The kind that happens when people convince you that your work doesn't matter, that you don't matter. I told them everything. The dinner, the betrayal, the discovery of the forged signature. The moment I decided to stop being useful to other people and start being useful to myself. The most dangerous thing you can do, I told them, is decide that you deserve better. Because once you truly believe that, you become unstoppable. After the speech, students lined up to talk to me. Many of them were working in family businesses where they felt invisible. Some were in relationships where their contribution was taken for granted. All of them were trying to figure out how to claim their own power. To each one, I said the same thing. Document everything. Know your value. And never, ever let someone convince you that you're replaceable. If you're truly replaceable, then they should have no problem without you. Let them try. 10 years after the dinner, I received word that my father had died. Heart attack. Quick. He was found at his desk in the small house where he'd been living, the house I'd provided to him and my mother as part of the settlement. I didn't feel grief. I felt a strange sort of relief, like a chapter finally closing. I paid for his funeral. I sent flowers. I didn't attend. My mother had passed 3 years earlier. I'd wept for her, actually, not because I forgave her, but because I'd finally understood that she was as much a victim of my father's narcissism as I had been. She just hadn't had the strength to escape it. The funeral was small. Julian attended. He was the only family member there besides the mortician and the minister. Afterward, he called me. He asked for you, Julian said quietly. At the end, he was delirious, but he kept saying your name. He wanted to apologize. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I'm glad I wasn't there. I finally said, an apology at the end doesn't erase a lifetime of disrespect. I forgave him years ago, not for his sake, but for mine. I couldn't have built what I've built if I was still carrying his weight. I know, Julian said. I just wanted you to know that he knew. At the very end, he knew what he'd lost. That was the only apology I needed. 15 years after that dinner, the Beatrice Miller Estates had expanded to 6 locations across the city. 500 families lived in housing I'd built. 2,000 people had gone through the job training programs in the community centers. The real estate portfolio had tripled in value. But the numbers weren't what mattered. What mattered was the email I received from a woman named Sarah. Dear Ms. Miller, it read, I live in Unit 47 of the downtown community center. When we moved in 3 years ago, we were homeless. My daughter was sleeping in my car. Now she's in 3rd grade with her own bedroom, and she has dreams. She wants to be a teacher. Your housing gave her that. Thank you. I printed that email and framed it. I hung it in my office, right next to the photograph of my grandmother. What mattered was the teenager I hired as an intern who'd come from the community center, who was now working toward his MBA while managing 2 of my properties, who called me Ms. Miller with the kind of respect that came from genuine gratitude, not obligation. What mattered was that I built something that outlasted me, something that would keep building long after I was gone. I'd finally understood what my grandmother had been trying to teach me. Real power isn't the power to destroy. It's the power to create, to build, to see people, to make them visible. I stood in the dining room of the Elm Street Victorian, setting the table for a family dinner. Not the family I was born into, the family I'd chosen. Daniel was setting the wine glasses. Grace was putting out napkins with the seriousness only a 6-year-old could muster. Julian was in the kitchen, helping with the appetizers. His crew had just finished the renovation on the newest community center, and we were celebrating. On the wall, behind me, was a portrait of my grandmother. It had been painted from a photograph commissioned from an artist in the city. She was standing with her hands on her hips, looking directly at the viewer with a kind of quiet power. Above it, I'd hung a quotation in elegant script. The most powerful thing a woman can do is learn to value herself. Everything else follows from that. Beatrice Eleanor Miller, 1951. The table was set with the china that had belonged to my grandmother, the crystal glasses that had survived my father's negligence, the silver that my mother had polished every Sunday, even when no one appreciated her effort. Tonight, it would be used the way it was meant to be used, with intention, with joy, with love. Dinner's ready. Julian called from the kitchen. As we all sat down at the table, I looked around at these people, this family I'd built, and I felt something that I'd never felt at that dinner 10 years ago. I felt home, not because anyone was serving me, not because anyone was pretending, but because we were all here genuinely choosing to be together, valuing each other, seeing each other. Grace reached over and squeezed my hand. "This is my favorite dinner, Mama." "Why is that, sweetheart?" I asked. "Because you're happy," she said simply. "You're happy and you're here." I looked at my daughter, this child who would grow up knowing that she was valuable, that she could build, that she didn't need anyone's permission to claim her worth. And I felt the weight of 10 years finally lift completely that night after everyone had left. I sat on the porch of the Elm Street Victorian with a glass of wine. The town stretched out below me, lit by streetlights and possibility. Somewhere out there, in one of the properties I managed, a young woman was studying for her real estate license. Somewhere else, a family was celebrating moving into their first home. Somewhere, someone who'd felt invisible was learning to see themselves. I thought about that dinner, about Sloane's voice, dripping with cruelty, about my father's casual dismissal, about my mother's cold hand on my arm. I'd spent so long being angry at them, and then I'd spent years being grateful to them, grateful for the clarity their rejection had given me, grateful for the motivation it had provided. But now I'd moved past both anger and gratitude. I'd moved into understanding. They were small people, not because they lacked money or status, but because they couldn't see beyond themselves. They couldn't value what they had because they were too busy coveting what they didn't. They couldn't appreciate Beatrice the person because they only understood Beatrice the function. And that was their loss, not mine. I took a sip of my wine and smiled. I was no longer the invisible CEO. I was no longer the overlooked daughter or the ignored sister. I was no longer replaceable. I was Beatrice Eleanor Miller, and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I built an empire not by stealing or destroying, but by creating something that mattered, by seeing people, by valuing them, by understanding that real wealth is measured in the lives you touch, the legacy you build, the future you create for others. My father had spent his whole life accumulating. I'd spent 10 years learning to create, and in the end, creation was infinitely more powerful than accumulation. I looked at the oak floors, gleaming in the moonlight, at the stained glass windows my grandmother had loved, at the house I'd restored with my own hands, one board and one nail and one moment of faith at a time. This was mine, not given to me, built by me, earned by me, created by me, and nothing, not anger, not betrayal, not cruelty, not dismissal, could ever take that away. The documentary premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. It was called Invisible, The Rise of Beatrice Miller, and it told the story of how a property manager became an urban developer, how a dismissed daughter became a visionary, how one woman's decision to stop being useful to others and start being useful to herself changed the trajectory of an entire city. The filmmaker had interviewed everyone except my family. Sloan had refused to participate. My mother was dead. My father had been dead for a decade. Only Julian had agreed, and what he said on camera was powerful. I watched my sister decide to stop drowning with us. I watched her swim to shore, and instead of pulling us back down, she built a lighthouse. That says everything you need to know about who she is. The film won the Audience Award for Best Documentary. Grace, now 26 years old and an architect working alongside Daniel, was in the audience. She watched her mother on screen, this woman who'd become an icon of female entrepreneurship and resilience. And she saw herself, not in the fame or the success, but in the backbone it required to stand alone and build something that mattered. After the screening, there was a gala. I was invited to speak. I looked out at the audience, this sea of faces that included entrepreneurs, investors, activists, and people from the community housing projects who'd been given tickets by the foundation I'd established. And I thought about how far we'd come. Someone once told me I was replaceable. I began. And she was technically right. Anyone can manage properties. Anyone can run a company. But not everyone can do it with integrity. Not everyone can do it while uplifting the people around them. Not everyone can build something that lasts. I paused, looking directly at the camera. If you're the invisible one in your family, in your workplace, in your life, if you're the one who does the work that goes unnoticed, I want you to know something. Your work matters. Your effort matters. And more importantly, you matter. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Waiting for someone else to recognize your value is like waiting for the sun to revolve around the earth. It's not going to happen. You have to be the one who sees yourself. You have to be the one who says, I am worth more than this. And then you have to build a life that proves it. That's what I did. And it was the best decision I ever made. The applause that followed felt different than the applause at the gala 15 years earlier. This time, it wasn't about amazement at my success. It was about recognition of a truth that was becoming obvious. The invisible people were no longer accepting invisibility. Women were no longer waiting for permission to be seen. And the world was changing because of it. I am standing in my grandmother's garden, the one I've spent 20 years restoring. The orchids are blooming, stark white ones, the exact shade Sloan had demanded for her wedding. But these aren't for show. They're for me. They're for the garden I built on the foundation my grandmother left me. Grace is beside me, sketching the new community center design. Julian is in the distance, overseeing the construction crew, working on the fourth expansion. Daniel is inside, going over the financial reports that show, once again, another year of growth and impact. I'm 62 years old. I'm the most successful woman in my city. I'm respected, admired, and by some accounts, feared. But none of that matters. What matters is that I'm visible. What matters is that I'm not doing this for my family. I'm not doing this for my father's approval or my sister's envy or my mother's validation. I'm doing this for me. And that single shift from external validation to internal conviction was the only magic required. I look at a picture someone took of me last week, speaking at a university. I'm standing at a podium, sunlight streaming across my face, and I'm smiling. Behind me is a banner that reads, "The Architect of Change, Beatrice Miller on Building Legacy." In that picture, I'm not invisible anymore. I'm not replaceable. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And the best part, I did it all by myself. If you're reading this, and you're the useful one in your family, the one who does the work, who manages the logistics, who keeps everything running while everyone else gets to shine, I want you to know something. You are not invisible. You are not replaceable. You are not forgotten. You're just waiting for yourself to see what everyone else eventually will. That you were always the most powerful person in the room. You just have to decide when to stop building someone else's house and start building your own.